So it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr Helen De Cruz is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy in Oxford Brookes University. She has a first degree in Archaeology and Art Studies from Ghent University, and then is one of those amazing people with 2 PhDs. The first one also in Archaeology and Art from Ghent, and then subsequently a PhD in Philosophy from the University of the Free University of Brussels. Let me get that right. Is that right?
The philosophy one's from Groningen.
No, it's from Groningen. That's why I
Groningen,
hesitated when I said that. My notes were a bit muddled. She specializes in the philosophy of cognitive science, and her work concerns questions of how humans form beliefs in domains that are remote from everyday concerns, such as mathematics, theology, and science. Interested in metaethics and evolutionary explanations of morality, bringing her archaeological findings into the philosophical discussions. And her title today is Openness and Deference, the Role of Awe in Scientific and Religious Discourse. And will you join me in welcoming Helen?
Thank you so much for coming over here, especially as the weather is so beautiful and Cambridge is so beautiful. I've never seen it before and it's really beautiful. Like, you know, it's like Oxford, but slightly differently. Really interesting. So this is an ongoing research project of mine on the role of epistemic emotions in science and religion, and trying to investigate what role emotions, particularly emotions relating to aesthetic appraisal, might play a role in both science and religion. So probably if you go to some of the talks here, it will not be a surprise to you that there are these different models on how we should conceptualize the relationship between science and religion. And very often, especially in more popular culture, this is still seen as a conflict model. So the conflict model is still very influential, and sometimes you tend to forget that if you're working a lot in science and religion and you think it's going so well together. But if you look at popular culture, then people have this conflict model. And just to give an example of such a person, so Jeremy Coyne says that there is a fundamental epistemological difference between science and religion. So it's very different, the way that scientists and people of faith interact with evidence. And he thinks that the difference is faith. So he says, faith may be a gift in religion, but in science it's poison, for faith is no way to find truth in any field, according to him. Now, you're probably well familiar with the more sort of common ground views. Views such as Wenzel van Herstein, who sees science and religion as being in a respectful dialogue. Or Ian Barber, who basically started this whole discussion in the 1960s, who sees integration between science and religion as something we can ultimately hope for. And so very often this is also cashed out in epistemological terms, not always. Sometimes people think about the metaphysics, but sometimes, like for example, Harrison famously argued that science and religion share common ground because of certain assumptions about how the world works or how our own cognition works. So he thinks that the idea that people had that there was a fall, a historical fall, where humans lost a lot of their cognitive capacities, their ability of being in proper rapport with God, actually made them fallible, and that would have given them the idea that you should investigate things empirically, and you can't just use your reason because your reason is defective. So those kinds of proposals are common as well. But I think that in this whole discussion, the role of emotions hasn't received as prominent a place as it could have, and particularly epistemic emotions. And I'll focus on awe as an epistemic emotion, and I'll look at how it could function in science and religion and at common ground. So I'll argue that awe plays a foundational role in both science and religion, and I'll draw on work of the Jewish theologian Joshua Abraham Heschel. And then I'll wonder, why does it do that? Why is awe so important for religion, something we already know for a while, but also for science, which is something we've only recently been finding out, thanks to empirical research, which I will talk about. And then I'll sort of, this is my tentative proposal, is in how far is scientific practice similar to some religious practices, in particular mystical practices. Now this is very sort of early days of thinking about this, so that's a tentative proposal. So we have epistemic emotions. We have all sorts of different kinds of emotions. Cognitive scientists have for a long time neglected emotions because they couldn't get a proper handle on it, like what are emotions? So for the purposes of this talk, I'll take this working definition that emotions are physiological states that have a valence, so they could be positive or negative or ambivalent. There are things like happiness, love, anger, sadness. Some emotions have a face associated to them, you know, like the anger face and the happiness face, but not all emotions have a face associated with them, like the love face. There's no love face, interestingly. You don't see if somebody else is in love with you, which, you know, Shakespeare and like wouldn't have been written if there were a love face. So it's not always obvious, the external signs that somebody is having an emotion, but surely you can feel it within you that you have an emotion. And one particular area of emotions that I want to focus on are epistemic emotions. Epistemic emotions have to do with knowledge. So when we think about our knowledge, curiosity, for example, so we're not the only creatures that are curious, like cats are curious and other animals are curious. They might want to find out what's there. I want to know what's there. So you feel, when you're curious, you feel there's a gap in your knowledge you want to investigate. And then you have other emotions such as, for example, wonder and awe, which are also epistemic emotions. Now, Bas van Fraassen is a philosopher of science, and he has thought quite a bit about emotions and what role they could play in science. So he talked about the role of emotions in scientific practice. Particularly, Van Fraassen was puzzled by the following thing. What happens when a paradigm changes? So in science, as Thomas Kuhn famously argued in his Structure of Scientific Revolution in 1962, sometimes scientific paradigms change and people get a completely different way of looking at things. One example is from geocentrism to heliocentrism, and then later developments in astronomy. Now, before this happens, or from Phlogiston's theory to oxygen theory, before that happens though, people feel like things are not going 100% with the old paradigm. So he says, imagine you're a scientist, imagine a scientist, totally inside a scientific world picture that is becoming more and more burdened with more and more blatant anomalies, severe calculational difficulties, failing predictions and epicycle-laden explanations. So the paradigm is not in great shape. But yet Van Fraassen thinks that it's very difficult to find your way out of that. Because what happens is, some people are beginning to talk about a strange new theory. It makes absolutely no sense. It violates the most basic commonsensical expectations of what nature can be like. So imagine you're a phlogiston chemistry person in the 17th century. In the 18th century, it starts getting there's all sorts of anomalies, like how do we explain that if you heat things up, they become warmer and other things become lighter? Phlogiston can't explain that. Then you have all of a sudden this oxygen theory that's coming in, and what do you do with that? How do you accept that? How should a scientist proceed? Now, here, philosophers of science actually think that it could still be rational to stick with the old theory. Why is that? Because the old theory has a lot of it going for it. It still explains a great deal. Taking this new theory is like a leap of faith. But how can you take such a leap? Now, according to Van Fraassen, what you have to do as a scientist to take this leap to this new unfamiliar theory, you have to transform yourself. It's almost like a conversion experience. Now, this has been recently investigated by Laurie Paul in her work on transformative experiences. That sometimes you are faced with situations where ordinary decision theory can't help you. Like, for example, should I have a child? You don't know what it would be like for you to be a parent. Should I move to another country? You don't know what it would be like. Should I take this new theory that I don't know if it's going to be successful? Should I risk it? As ordinary decision theory does not help, how can a scientist without ordinary rational decision making decide to make this leap? Now, Van Fraassen, drawing on autobiographical accounts of scientists, argues that emotions play a crucial role in this process. There is a radical shift in the attitudes and the self, and he draws on Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of emotions as a form of transforming yourself. Jean-Paul Sartre made, in his short treatise on the emotions, makes this, he says that emotions actually help us. They help us to look at the world differently. And he makes this nice analogy with voodoo and magic. Why is voodoo, why does it work? Why does it work to stick a pin in a doll? You're not hurting the other person, as far as we know. Well, you're not transforming the doll, you're not transforming the world, but you're transforming yourself. Magic works because you are transforming yourself. And in that way, you transform how you are being positioned in the world. So your being in the world is transformed through the emotions. And this is actually not so dissimilar for example, Stump's account of the Eucharist and petitionary prayer. It's not that we're changing God doing these things. It's that we are changing ourselves and our attitude. And that's why it works. And emotions, according to Sartre, play a crucial role in this. And so Van Fraassen, taking this Sartrean framework, argues that we can transform ourselves as scientists when we're in these difficult situations of these paradigm shifts to transform ourselves. Now, what emotions would help us? Van Fraassen doesn't specify what emotions scientists would draw upon to help them in their work. But I think here another resource can be helpful. So I'll now spend a little bit of time talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel, who argues that awe and wonder play a crucial role both in scientific practice and in religion. But he does draw some disanalogies that we'll also look at. So he says that awe and wonder are foundational for both scientific and religious practice. And he calls the sense of wonder the semen scientiae, the seed of knowledge. It's before you even get to the idea of investigating, you are in wonder about the world around you. You're in awe of the world around you to think the world is so much bigger than I am. I'm so small and the world is so big. And that's a fundamental attitude that both scientists and religious people have. So it is actually a way of understanding, because when you look, and I know there's light pollution and air pollution and so on, but when you look outside the night sky and you probably take the time to take this in and be in wonder at the night sky, then you have also a sense of an understanding. It's a kind of understanding you can't translate into words. It's an understanding, an act of insight that the world is so much bigger than you are. Heschel even says that awe is the only way to wisdom. You need to have this state in order to be a properly wise person. So awe and wonder function both in science and religion to help us gain insight and wisdom. But if you then look further on, then most of the stuff that Heschel is concerned with is with awe and wonder in religion. How can we use that? How can we deal with these emotions? How can we make them properly play the role that they can play? So he says that awe is foundational for faith. It actually is the feeling that is prior to faith. Before you can have faith, you have awe. And actually, the term Yirat Hashem, awe of God, is almost synonymous for religion. Now, what is the threat to both of these things, to scientific and religious inquiry, is taking things for granted. It's just looking around and say, oh yeah, it's all, this is the world and this is what it is. And you feel like completely at home in the world and you take everything for granted and everything in your stride. He says this is really fatal to scientific and religious practice. So how do you stop that? Because it's not easy to keep that sense of wonder and awe alive. Now he says that religion actually presents you as a kind of cognitive technology. By being a religious Jewish person, you can use the blessings, the study of the Torah, and the prayer 3 times a day, and of course the special rituals throughout the years, to really help to keep that sense of awe and wonder alive. And he gives the example of blessings. So there are various blessings in Judaism for various occasions, such as, for example, when you hear really good news. You say, "Blessed are you, O God." You know, something about the good news. I don't know these blessings by heart. Then if you meet a very wise person, likewise, if you see a rainbow, there's a special blessing for the rainbow because it reminds them of the covenant with God. There are blessings for the blossoms, the first blossoms in springtime to be said between March and April, for eating, for drinking. And actually, you can think of this as a kind of mindfulness technology. By using these blessings, you keep on feeling this sense of maladjustment, of the world being a marvelous place that you don't fully understand. So that's what makes it an epistemic emotion, because this lack of full grasp is really important. Once you completely understand something, according to Heschel, then the sense of awe and wonder goes away. Now, even though Heschel thinks that awe and wonder both play an important role in science, he thinks that with science, the role is limited. So he says that once a scientific theory, once it is announced and accepted, doesn't need to be repeated twice a day, unlike a religious blessing. So once you have uncovered something, then the role of awe and wonder is gone for science, but not for religion. So I think that Heschel is right that awe and wonder are important for science and religion, but I think he's wrong in thinking that in science it is a much more circumscribed role. I think there is an important possibility there for thinking about how we can use or how we can see awe in scientific practice. And indeed, as he argues, the greatest hindrance to an awareness of the divine is our adjustment to conventional notions and to mental cliches, which is certainly a problem if you're a scientist. If you start thinking in cliches, you need to be able to think out of the box. Wonder or radical amazement, the state of maladjustment to words and notions, is therefore a prerequisite for an authentic awareness of that which is. He talks about the awareness of the divine, but you could further extend this to scientific practice. So the main thrust of my argument is going to be that Heschel is right, that all lies at the basis of science and religion, but scientific practice also needs some cultivation of awe. But the question is how? I don't really have an answer to that question, so maybe that's something we can further discuss, but I have some ideas about how it could be. We need awe, not only for theory change, as Van Fraassen argued, but also for scientific discovery and perhaps even in scientific education. So what is awe? So wonder and awe are distinct emotions. I'll now focus on awe. And to make things even more complicated, authors in the past, such as Heschel, have often used awe and wonder almost synonymously. But anyway, so awe was a subject of lots of interest in the 18th century, particularly by Edmund Burke, who wrote a really influential book called The Beautiful and the Sublime, where he said that the beautiful is something that our minds can grasp and that tends to be smoother and more regular, whereas the sublime is something that is more ambiguous. So there is pleasure as well as pain involved of the perception of the sublime, such as rugged landscapes, things that aren't completely clear, like obscurity or partial obscurity gives us a sense of the sublime. Things that inspire some fear in us give us a sense of the sublime. Kant actually built a lot on that account of Burke in the 18th century in his Third Critique, and Herder actually had a similar view, except that he thought that you could still have awe even if you understood something completely, whereas other authors like Burke think that a lack of understanding is important for it. Now, awe is related to terror because it does give us this sense of a feeling that is close to fear. It fills our minds and it hurries us on by an irresistible force. So there's something like when you're in awe of something, you feel like, I need to be doing something. Or now, there was the contemporary work on awe owes much of on the Darwinian framework that was developed by Charles Darwin in 1871, 1872. where he argued that emotions, why do we have emotions? So why do we feel things like, why do you feel sad? Sadness isn't pleasant. Why would you feel sad? Well, sadness is an emotion that helps you, that motivates you to, for instance, stop the thing that's making you sad. Or, well, this isn't always possible, which is unfortunate, but it is still, that's the adaptive function of sadness. Why do we have fear? Well, a gazelle's running around in the savannah who feels fear for a lion and will run. The running out of fear goes a lot faster than it would if that animal didn't have any sort of motivating emotions. So emotions are motivators. They're there to help us act. Now, the idea is that humans live in very complex groups. We live in very complex, hierarchically structured groups, and emotions help us to deal with further problems, particularly with all sorts of problems related to group living. And awe is an emotion like that, in that it has two characteristics. So on the one hand, it's a self-transcendent emotion because it makes us go outside of ourselves. Like awe is always for something. You can't be in awe of yourself, at least an ordinary person. You know, like maybe Donald Trump is in awe of himself, but normal people are not in awe of themselves. You're always in awe of something else. So it's self-transcendent, going outside of yourself. But it's also epistemic because you get this sense of, I don't fully understand this. And you really get an emotional push from that. Now, a very influential account of awe is Keltner and Haidt's prototype account, formulated in 2003, where they argue there are two central elements to awe. On the one hand, there is perceived vastness. So something you're in awe is always big, like a big music symphony or a big all-encompassing theory or a big landscape or the starry sky above. And secondly, there is a need for accommodation. So you feel like somehow this is this irresistible force that Burke talked about. I need to do something in response to this. I can't fully accommodate this. Now, why do we feel awe? And here, now the problem with these evolutionary explanations is you can't test them directly. But they argue that awe is originally evolved so that, or to function so, that we feel deference for a more socially powerful individual. So think about alpha males or females in a chimpanzee troop, and you have this really impressive alpha male. You could try to overthrow him, but it's going to cost you a lot of time, energy, effort, wasted effort. So you will just feel in awe, and that will motivate you to basically defer to that individual, and that solidifies hierarchical relationships. Now, this is a very productive account. So ever since Keltner and Haidt wrote this paper, the research on awe really took off in the past decade and a bit. But there are some problems with the account, as with all beginning accounts. Namely, why is awe most elicited by non-social situations? So if you ask ordinary people, like, you know, when did you last feel awe? It's almost always going to be for nature, music, art, that sort of thing. And mostly nature, not other humans, which is kind of strange. Secondly, is awe really that rare? So there's been diary studies where people had to write it down. And apparently awe is not this once-in-a-lifetime feeling that Keltner and Haidt, they thought it was really exceptional at exceptional occasions. It doesn't seem to be the case. And also, how do we explain the epistemic dimension of awe? So they talk about need for accommodation, but this evolutionary explanation does not make sense of that. It doesn't make us understand why we should want to accommodate, why we would feel this need. After all, if there's a powerful individual and you just defer to them, why? So I don't quite see how, and I don't see any recent literature to really explain that dimension adequately. Now looking a bit at awe in science, it's a science and religion talk, so I will have a Dawkins quote. There has to be a Dawkins quote. So here, Dawkins writes about that the great religions have a place for awe, for ecstatic transport at the wonder and beauty of creation. And it's exactly this feeling of spine-shivering, breath-catching awe, almost worship, this flooding of the chest with epiphanic wonder that modern science can provide. And it does so beyond the wildest dreams of saints and mystics. The fact that the supernatural has no place in our explanations and our understanding of the universe and life doesn't diminish the awe. So he thinks there's a really important part, a really important role of awe in science, and he's not the only one. So lots of scientists in their more sort of autobiographical moments, and I have a whole paper on this if you're interested. I can send it to you. It's coming out in an Essart volume soon. Scientists such as Rachel Carson, Jane Goodall, Richard Feynman, Richard Dawkins talk about this role of emotion, of awe as an emotion in science. And there have been a few empirical studies to investigate whether non-scientists also have this connection between awe and science. So one study, people saw this Planet Earth video that you saw in the beginning, so the sort of vistas, sweeping vistas, and they saw it in VR. And then they asked people a questionnaire about what they all knew, and people always tend to overestimate what they know, but people who saw the awe condition compared to a funny nature video were much more likely to say that there were lots of things they didn't know. And also, when they were asked, how would you like to be paid for this experiment? Would you like tickets to a science museum or tickets to an art museum? The people in the awe condition were much more likely to want the tickets from the art museum. And there's other research by Gottlieb and colleagues that looks at dispositional awe. So you fill in a questionnaire about how often you feel awe. And people who have higher dispositional awe tend to be people who are more accepting of science, so they're less distrustful of science. They understand more how science works, and they're more likely to reject young Earth creationism, which is really interesting because dispositional awe also correlates with religiosity. So you think on the face of it, religious people, maybe they're more young Earth creationists, especially in the United States where the study was done, but that was turning out not to be the case once you took into account awe. Next to that, there is also lots of research, more than between science and awe, which is a very recent research program. There's also lots of research showing that there is a connection between awe and religiosity. So if you have more awe, then you will feel, or you induce awe, more a feeling of oneness and spirituality, increased endorsement of a providential creator God. And the reverse is also true. When people are asked, can you remember the last time that you had a spiritual experience, they're more likely to report feelings of awe that go together with that experience, more than other emotions like happiness. So how does awe accomplish this? Why is awe foundational? Why does it seem to be important both for science and religion? So I think that drawing on this distinction on awe as both a self-transcendent emotion, and so that makes us go beyond ourselves, and an epistemic emotion, that awe does it in two ways. So awe is not rare, by the way. This is something that, so Heschel thought that awe was something that you could cultivate through these blessings, and it turns out lots of people do have this feeling more often than was previously thought. So openness. High dispositional awe has been associated with openness. Openness, so people who are more prone to feel awe are open to new ideas, have a lower need for cognitive closure. The need for cognitive closure is you want solutions. You want an unambiguous answer. People don't like ambiguity. People don't like it when things aren't resolved, so that's cognitive closure. And a higher tolerance for ambiguity. Awe also makes people less reliant on stereotypes, scripts, and cliches. So in this study, people were given a strong and a weak argument for something relating to university policy, really a boring argument. But anyway, you got either a strong or a weak one. And as you can see in the neutral condition, people thought the weak argument, the black bars, were a lot weaker than the strong arguments. But interestingly, if you give people positive emotions like amusement and contentment, then the appraisal of the weak argument goes up. That's why commercials always want to make you feel happy, because then your critical thinking goes completely out of the window. But interestingly, awe and compassion were the only two positive emotions that brought the appraisal of the weak argument down. So awe helps you to think more critically. And it's several other studies that show similar results. However, inducing awe in people who are not prone to it results sometimes in an increased need for cognitive closure and less comfort with ambiguity, at least according to one study. And that suggests that if awe is going to play a productive role, it's not enough to show people one Planet Earth video. You'll have to do this regularly. You have to cultivate it as a practice, as Heschel says. So the second element of awe that I think makes it conducive in science is that awe leads to deference. Now, this is part of the original proposal of Keltner and Haidt, that awe gives us feelings of deference for a more socially powerful individual. And it's also been shown in various studies, such as this one. People were either placed in a grove of eucalyptus trees. This was a study done in Tasmania, where you have groves of eucalyptus trees. Or they were put in front of ugly university buildings, and they had to do a questionnaire such as, honestly, I feel I'm just more deserving than others. And people standing in between the university buildings, you know, lots of people say, yeah, I'm more deserving. If I'm really honest, I'm more deserving than other individuals. Whereas people who were put in the forest thought they were less deserving than others. So really quite a nice fact size. Then asked, how much would you like? Anything between $1 and $10 for your participation. People in the forest also had, they accepted lower amounts of money. So there's this sense of deference. Deference is really important for cultural evolution. If we didn't defer to authority, there would just not be any culture. This has been shown also in various studies on over-imitation. Humans do it, other animals don't. It's really important in science, so people tend to over-imitate because better safe than sorry. Protocols in science, like the amount of solvent that you put in preparations. But really, do we need deference in scientists? Don't we need like brilliant minds that come up with all sorts of brilliant, independent ideas? What about the brilliant mavericks? So I had to think a bit about the brilliant mavericks. I think one thing to recognize is brilliant mavericks are really rare. Like, you know, if you think about even someone like Darwin, by the way, who was in a position of privilege, as Curry says, brilliant mavericks tend to be independently wealthy. Even so, if you look at Darwin's work, there is a bigger picture, an emerging picture in which you can situate him, that he was interested in. And there is deference towards other ideas like, you know, Malthus and other intellectual ideas at the time. Also, it turns out that maybe diversity is more important than just having mavericks. And actually, if you look at much of scientific practice, is just following the results of others, as Kuhn already said. Now, how can science be thought of as a kind of religious practice? So this is where I'm not entirely sure, but I think that it is really important for scientists to keep this sense of awe alive. In the context of discovery, theory, change, science, education, if scientists didn't have any epistemic emotions, sure, they might be driven by things like prestige, but if you're only driven by that, it can go horribly wrong, as all sorts of cases of scientific fraud seem to show. So there has to be some sense of awe. But how might that be cultivated? Now, Heschel's response is through ritual. Ritual helps you to, and science actually has lots of rituals. So if you are, you know, if you're an archaeologist or any other scientist, you just have to follow the procedures as you're being educated. Now, people have thought about the role of ritual, such as, for example, Poet. He says that commonly people think of ritual as a form of adjustment, as falling into ruts. But he says, no, rituals are the opposite of falling into ruts. Rituals are ways to put yourself in a maladjusted state. There is something unsettling about rituals. And rituals really are the sorts of things that take effort. So if you think about the blessings or the prayers, even though you can incorporate it in your day-to-day life, it's still not the same as, say, falling in the couch at 7 o'clock with some crisps and watching Netflix, you know, the sort of thing that makes no effort. Rituals do take effort. And in science, you do have ritualistic things of that kind. You have training in experimental procedures. You have certain standards of rigor that people are supposed to be adhering to. So, ritual practices help us to regulate emotions and help us to orient ourselves differently to the world. At least according to Heschel, this is concretely what happens. This is how Judaism is, in his view, a cognitive technology, because it helps us look differently at the world. It changes our way that we engage with the world and makes us thereby more receptive to God. Because if you are always taking things for granted, then you just don't notice it. You just don't know, you're not receptive to the science. And similarly, I think in science, the cultivation of awe can make us more receptive to the world and its wonders. And I do think it plays a role in some sense, in some under-recognized sense, that you do see in biographies of scientists, even in things like science education, that ultimately help science work the way it does. And maybe in science education, one should do more of an effort to try to cultivate awe on a regular basis, because awe can help us be more open-minded to new theories. It can help against self-aggrandizement through this promotion of the small self, because awe, the feeling of awe leads to a sense of small self. And this can be really important, given that in academia there are all these sort of different, you know, you have to get forward and get all these accolades and promotions and so on. I mean, you know how it goes. So it can help us instill deference to proper results and proper theories. Now, I think that actually in science education we could do better, because Heschel already in 1955 said that science education doesn't stress awe enough. The awareness of grandeur and the sublime is all but gone from the modern mind. He doesn't just mean in education, but in general. In education specifically, if you think about it, children now have to do all sorts of these standardized tests, and there isn't enough about the sublime. Our systems of education stress the importance of enabling the student to exploit the power aspect of reality. To some degree, they try to develop this ability to appreciate beauty, but there is no education for the sublime. We teach the children how to measure, how to weigh. We fail to teach them how to revere, how to sense wonder and awe. The sense for the sublime, the sign of inward greatness of the human soul, something which is potentially given to all man, is now a rare gift. But without it, the world becomes flat and the soul a vacuum. So, cultivating in science education would also give people, if the literature is correct, a sort of more tolerance for unsolved questions and for ambiguity. And I think this might be important because science is on the defensive. I mean, if I were still a scientist, I'd be hugely worried. I think everybody should be hugely worried about how science is on the defensive with a general derision of expertise and a general denialism for, you know, various things like climate change. Now, what do we do about that? Now, one way in which scientists have countered this is by just presenting things as facts. Things like evolution is not a theory, it's a fact. And they try to put it up as this fact-like status. But the problem is that it doesn't really seem to help because there are these powerful echo chambers and they present different facts. So I think that a more enduring solution would be to try to instill this, to keep this openness alive in science education in some sense. In some sense, I think it's already there, particularly if you go on to be a scientist and you learn these protocols and you learn to, you know, as part of your practice, you're in wonder and awe about the things you're doing, but particularly in secondary education, even in primary education, the sense of awe could be cultivated more, and that would help students also to get a better sense of the nature of science. Because as I've said, awe gives you both deference and openness, which is very important both for religion and science. So to conclude, I've argued that emotions play a really important regulative function in our epistemic lives. Van Fraassen argued that they're really important for theory change because they help us to transform ourselves. And he sees emotions as being really important in these transformative experiences when scientists have to find new theories. But given that we see that an emotion like awe is not a one-off emotion, but that it's something that sort of continuously guides scientific practice, it's not just there when there's theory change, but in various other things like the discovery of new scientific ideas. So awe is an important epistemic emotion. It's useful in science. And one thing that I didn't find a concrete solution to is the question about how can we instill it more in scientific education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Some time for questions, and I think Steph probably has got the microphone. Let's come down the front here.
Thank you very much. Very enjoyable. Now, awe and wonder are often mentioned in the same breath. Are you in fact distinguishing between the two?
Yes. In this paper, I'm just focusing on awe. So I have another paper where I also talk about wonder. The problem is the research on wonder is very, like there isn't a big influential wonder account like there is an awe account. So that's a bit of the problem. So psychologists haven't really properly done lots of studies about it. But it seems to me that wonder is less overwhelming. Wonder is more like curiosity than awe is. And it could be for something really small, like you learn, for example, that every snowflake is unique, and then you see pictures of different snowflakes and you think, oh my goodness, they're all unique, and look how intricate. So that's kind of the difference in that it's less overwhelming, it's more for smaller things, but it does have this sense of this need for accommodation that is important for both of them. But vastness isn't necessarily part of wonder.
Thank you. Right at the back, Alexander.
Thank you very much for a really inspiring talk. I found lots of things very intriguing and agree with them. I would ask you, though, whether we should perhaps cultivate also a bit more of a discerning stance towards awe. So I'm agnostic about potential social origins of awe in an evolutionary account, but I'm convinced that there are very powerful experiences of awe in large-scale social situations. So I'm thinking of these mass rallies that the Nazis used to do in Germany in the 1930s, where they had themselves shouted at in very aggressive ways and then all rose as one. And there are pop concerts and many other events in which I would guess awe is a very powerful factor. And you'd find that today too. So, and that is probably a situation in which awe does not reduce stereotypes, but where other stereotypes might actually be imposed on us. So my question is, we'd have to be a bit more discerning there. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the dark side of awe. There's not that many papers on the dark side of awe. There was one that I found that was about awe for 9/11 and the like, and the burning of the Notre Dame. Like, whatever else you can say, it's awesome to watch. Like, not awesome great, but awesome terrible. Like, you're terrified when you're watching it. So the original account by Keltner and Haidt says that awe is flavored in different ways. So I've been looking at the way it's epistemically flavored, but it's not always that epistemically flavored. And in social situation, I'm guessing that that epistemic component really gets on the background. I'm not so sure. Or maybe, so here is like my ad hoc psychological theory. So when you cultivate awe regularly and properly as part of religious practices, for example, then you have more openness, less need for cognitive closure. But when you're not used to the feeling of awe, at least according to some studies, and you feel awe-inspired, then it can give you the opposite result, namely that you have more of a need for cognitive closure, you want less ambiguity, you want the world to be like black and white, and then you can easily see these rallies that you were talking about. So my guess is people particularly vulnerable to that are people who don't have awe in their everyday lives. And we should investigate whether that's the case, but I think at least the current empirical research shows that if you cultivate awe in your daily life, you're less susceptible to this sort of thing.
Thank you. Right down the front here.
Thank you very much. Do you find that there is more awe in people who live in, for instance, the mountains or on the seas or in different cultural groups?
Very few studies have looked at people's cross-culturally. So we don't really know. There was one cross-cultural study that showed it is higher in some groups, but I cannot, off the top of my head, say if they also lived in more awe-conducive environments. You almost think, right? But even so, I mean, I remember talking to this person who lived very close to the Alps, and I said, "That's really great. You live close." "Oh, I don't see them anymore, the Alps." I said, "Really? You don't see the Alps?" And "Oh, you know, I look out, and it's a..." So you need to do an effort to keep the awe alive, as Heschel already said. If you just, you know, you can easily slip into it. So maybe there's more stimuli there for you to be in awe of, but you still need to do the effort.
How, in a working scientific day, can you instill a sense of awe? You touched on that at the end. You can't say to somebody, "Be awesome now," or you can't even tell somebody, "This is awesome." They've got to experience it themselves.
Yeah.
How do you suggest we instill that?
I think in science, due to the practice of science, it does happen a bit by itself. So a good friend of mine, Robert Gilbert, who is a molecular scientist, and he works on viruses, like not the most pleasant thing, like really creepy, dangerous viruses, but he can still discover their structure and have a sense of awe and wonder and say, "Wow, this is amazing, the ingenuity of that." So I think in a sense in scientific practice it comes almost inevitably. If you're a working scientist, you know, through scientific practice it'll happen. But if you are being in science education in secondary school or even as an undergraduate, it does not happen because you're not actually doing the science yet. So that's why I think, you know, we should somehow put it inside our education, in our curriculum. I don't know how, maybe going out with children, you know, like forest schools, more of that stuff, I don't know.
So if I'm hearing you rightly, actually it says getting into the laboratory and doing the science instills science, whereas actually picking up the textbook and reading about it needn't necessarily give that same sense of awe?
I think it does. I mean, if you maybe remember when you were looking through microscopes as a secondary school student, it does. You know, if it works, because unfortunately school equipment being what it is, like half the microscopes don't work, but you know, that sort of thing. So it needs extra funding to work properly, I think, but to give people the ability to experience the stuff for itself and not just hear about it is really important.
Ruth over here, and then I'm seeing several on this side as well. We'll pick up.
I was interested in the study that said that if you have a higher disposition of awe, you're more likely to understand the nature of science and appreciate it. And I wondered if anyone had looked at different religious groups, say different Christian denominations, and looked at people's or disposition, if you like, within that, which may attract them to a particular denomination or be cultivated within a particular denomination, and people's acceptance of science. I suspect it's not been done, but I'd be really interested.
Yeah, I think there's only been a few studies that look at awe across different religious groups, and there was one study by Christine Caldwell-Harris with Buddhists, atheists, and Christians, and she found basically that they had similar levels of dispositional awe, which was kind of interesting given that atheism, well, I don't know how far as you can call it an ideology, and then Buddhism and Christianity seem to be quite different. But it would be really interesting to look more in detail at this relationship of religiosity, being a religious person, a person of faith, as a mediator in these things. Hasn't been done yet, but well, anyone at Cambridge can yeah, start this up.
A lady just here.
Thank you. Having been in Tasmanian forests, I can attest to them being absolutely awesome because I come from Australia. I'm really interested in your comments about awe and thinking about different denominations, just following on from that point, that in many countries, in the Western countries, the growing churches are the more evangelical fundamentalist churches, and the mainline Christian denominations seem to be in decline. And I'm just curious as to whether or not that experience of awe that's evoked in that style of worship, and maybe we've got a little bit used to the rituals that are in the mainline system. But how does that resonate with your work that you've done?
Yeah, I find this really fascinating. So I do really enjoy mainstream Protestant and Catholic rituals. I really do like them. I think they do give a sense of maladjustment. I mean, for one thing, kneeling is really uncomfortable, at least it is for me. But so there is a sense in which I think mainline churches have tried to make things too comfortable. And I think actually evangelical churches in the US are now going the same way. People are not looking for comfort. I mean, you can just sit at home and watch your television. People are looking for something different. They want to be shaken up a bit. And I think evangelical churches did a fairly good job doing that and shaking people up a bit and really trying to appeal to them, you know, with the music that sort of maybe it's not really me, this music, evangelical music, but you know, like Christian pop and the like. But it appeals to people. So I'm thinking mainline churches. This also ties in with this thing that cathedral services are holding up quite well. And I think they hold up quite well because they're so quaint, and so people, you know, there is a sense of maladjustment there, and I think it's important to keep that alive.
Come down the front here and then we'll move to the back if we've still got more time.
Thank you. Quite exciting one. I was just wondering if there is any study done to sort of look at the correlation between knowledge and awe, in the sense like as your knowledge progresses, do you have more awe, or does it have any correlation between the two?
It would be really good to have a longitudinal studies on this. Like, do people who have more awe, are they more able to acquire knowledge? We don't know. So the only thing we know is that people who have a higher dispositional awe have a better understanding of science. So but that's not a longitudinal study. So if you have a group of participants, those who are more awe-prone will have a better understanding of how science works, a better understanding of the nature of science, a better understanding of human origins. So it does seem to suggest that that's the case, but we would need to look over time how this changes people and how, I mean, if Van Frazen is right that these emotions help us to transform ourselves and look at the world differently, I would imagine that that's the case.
Thank you. Take Hugh there, and then we'll see if there might be time for one more afterwards.
Thanks. As you spoke about science and scientists, you tended to speak in the individual. Science is a corporate activity. How would you include that in your understanding of awe in science?
Yeah, definitely. So emotions can be shared. I think while it is usually investigated, the way I spoke of it individually is because, well, this is also to do with Van Frazen's sort of focus on scientists as, you know, epistemic agents. But most of the research done on awe has been done on the emotions individually, and that's just because of the way the research works. But I think, if anything, you could, it's important to get, what happens is you feel enthusiastic. Suppose, like my friend who is investigating the viruses, and he sees these really interesting structures that he didn't expect. He could go to his colleagues, because this was eventually a paper with 20 people, as it always is, you know, or at least 20 people, and say, this is really amazing. Look at this. This is wow. So I think there is a sense in which this enthusiasm can be socially shared. I still think it originates in the individual as an experience, and then somebody else could also feel awe, you know, being in part. I mean, there is some emotional contagion, but again, emotional contagion about awe hasn't been investigated, so I wouldn't know to answer that question precisely.
One final question from Dennis, who's been champing at the bit for some while, I think.
So I was interested by your comments on scientific rituals and being close to religious rituals, and just wondered what the extent of that was. I was trying to think about scientific rituals and what they might mean. So one of the common ones would be, in my mind anyway, would be a poster session at a conference. I mean, that's a scientific ritual which everyone goes through, and especially works well if you have a good bar and if you have free drinks, that works really well. So this is a ritual that one goes through hundreds of times. So that's the sort of ritual. But then I would think to myself that would arouse awe. But then you go into one of the main sessions with a leading speaker, and maybe if you go to 3 conferences a year, then maybe this will happen once every 3 years or something like that. That suddenly there is a talk where everyone at the end goes, wow, okay, this is suddenly, this is going to come out in Nature, this is going to come out in Cell, some are good, you know, and everyone is just looking at themselves afterwards. That was just amazing. And that's the talk you remember. So it seems to me that is a ritual in a way which can arouse awe. And I just wondered if you wanted to tell us some more rituals that you, I wasn't quite sure what you had in mind really with your scientific rituals. That sort of thing or other things?
I think science is full of rituals. So I use ritual in a very broad sense of, you know, the way we do things. So not only do you have these social rituals like conferences and the like that you talked about, but also say procedures, like archaeologists have a really specific way of sort of putting the area that they will look at, and the area next to it they don't look at, but that's for the future, because once you start digging it, it gets destroyed. And then you start, you know, so you have the tools with which you brush away the stuff. You have the bigger tools and then the finer tools. And so there's all these protocols and rituals. So I mean it really in that broad sense. And I'm not saying that you might immediately get a sense of awe there and then, although if you do uncover something really spectacular, you might get a sense of awe. But it's more those rituals help you to be aware of of the world in a way that you otherwise wouldn't be. And that helps to increase your disposition for awe. So even in the poster session, suppose you see a really interesting poster on some sort of psychological phenomenon or something. Even at that moment, you might not be especially overwhelmed by the poster. It still sort of puts it in your mind to think about that, to be looking out for that. So I think of it as a sort of technology that helps you to cultivate awe in your life as a scientist. Similar to how Heschel said that these blessings function in religious life.
Thank you ever so much. I think our time has come to a close. You've filled us with a sense of awe and wonder and the things that you've been saying. You can tell that from the number of questions that you provoked. So thank you ever so much for your talk this afternoon.
Thank you very much.